There are battles that decide kings, and there are battles that decide empires. But there is a third kind, battles that decide entire civilizations. In the autumn of 732 AD, the fate of Europe was decided by something impossible. Foot soldiers, without full armor, without cavalry, facing the most fearsome mounted army of the known world, and winning. This is the story of how a wall of ice stopped an invasion that had conquered 3 continents in less than a century. Imagine for a moment that it's the year 732. You're standing on the plains north of Tours, in Frankish territory. The air is biting cold. October's grip is tightening toward winter. Behind you lie farms, villages, monasteries. Families who have no idea that a storm is about to break over them. In front of you, on the southern horizon, a dust cloud rises. It's not wind, it's horses, thousands of them. Umayyad cavalry pouring in from Iberia, mounted warriors who've conquered everything from Damascus to the Pyrenees without a single decisive defeat to their name. And they're coming straight for you. This is the moment when Western Europe wakes up to a brutal new reality. The world has fundamentally changed, and if they can't find an answer fast, they'll cease to exist as anything recognizable. To understand what was at stake at Tours, you need to understand what had happened in the previous 100 years. In 632, the Prophet Muhammad died in Arabia. What he left behind was not just a religion, it was a revolutionary military force. The Umayyad Caliphate that emerged from this initial expansion was not just an empire. It was a conquest machine fueled by religious fervor, superior military organization, and a devastating tactical advantage: mobile cavalry. While European kingdoms stuck with heavy infantry and fixed fortifications, the Umayyads had perfected mounted warfare into an art form. Their horsemen weren't just quick, they were disciplined, coordinated, lethal. They could hit you from any angle, pull back, sweep around your flanks, and surround you faster than you could react, leaving traditional armies utterly confused. In less than 20 years after Muhammad's death, they'd conquered Syria, Egypt, Persia, and North Africa. Regions that had held off Rome for centuries? They fell in months. And then they crossed into Europe. In 711, Muslim forces led by Tariq ibn Ziyad crossed the Strait of Gibraltar and landed on the Iberian Peninsula. The Visigothic kingdom, which had ruled Iberia for 3 centuries, collapsed in a single campaign. By 718, practically the entire peninsula was under Muslim control. What had taken Rome generations to conquer fell in 7 years, and the Umayyads didn't stop. They crossed the Pyrenees. They began making incursions into the Frankish kingdom. Cities were sacked, monasteries burned. The message was clear. Europe was next. This is where Abd al-Rahman al-Ghafiqi enters our story. Governor of Al-Andalus. That's what the Muslims called Iberia. Al-Ghafiqi was everything an Umayyad commander should be. Brilliant, ruthless, absolutely committed to expanding the caliphate. He had no interest in quick raids. He wanted permanent conquest. In 732, Al-Ghafiqi assembled a massive force. Historians can't agree on exact numbers, but everyone agrees on one thing. It was enormous. Tens of thousands of mounted warriors, plus support troops and supply lines. His goal wasn't plunder. It was to smash into the heart of Western Europe and break it open. That fall, he marched north. His target? The wealthy abbey of Saint Martin of Tours. It wasn't just any monastery, it was a center of Christian power, a symbol of everything the Franks represented. Take Tours, and Paris was next. Take Paris, and nothing stood between the Umayyads and the Rhine. Rome could fall again, but this time under a different banner. The kingdoms of Western Europe were not prepared. Heavy cavalry, which would later become synonymous with European military power, had not yet been developed as a coordinated force. Most Frankish armies were infantry, spears, shields, axes, equipment designed for close combat and defensive lines. Effective against other foot soldiers. Completely vulnerable against a mounted cavalry charge. When mounted knights attack disorganized infantry, the result is slaughter. Cavalry has momentum. It has height. It has mobility. It can choose where to attack, when to retreat, how to flank. Infantry, especially without disciplined formation, panics, breaks, flees, and then is cut down from behind while running. That is why the Umayyad cavalry was so devastating. They didn't fight wars of attrition. They fought wars of psychological shock. A single well-executed charge could break an entire army. And they had perfected this tactic on 100 battlefields from Afghanistan to Spain. So, when news of al-Ghafiqi's march north reached the Franks, the terror was justified. How do you stop an army that moves faster than your messages? How do you defend cities when the enemy can bypass your fortifications? How do you fight against mounted warriors when your own soldiers are on foot? The answer should have been simple. You don't fight. You negotiate. You pay tribute. You survive by submitting. That was the choice that dozens of kingdoms had made, and most of them no longer existed. But there was one man who saw things differently. His name was Charles Martel, the Hammer, and he was about to do something that defied all military logic of the time. He was going to stop the cavalry with infantry. Charles Martel wasn't a king. He was mayor of the palace, a title that sounds modest, but actually meant he ran the entire Frankish kingdom, while the official king sat around looking ornamental. Martel had spent years consolidating power, crushing rivals, and bringing the Franks together under his control. He wasn't interested in ideology. He was a pure pragmatist, and he grasped something about warfare that most of his peers completely missed. Having more soldiers doesn't matter if you can't use them effectively. Speed means nothing if you can't capitalize on it. And cavalry, for all its devastating power in open fields, has vulnerabilities, weaknesses that could be exploited if you knew how. Martel had a radical theory. Cavalry got its power from momentum and psychological shock, the horror of seeing thousands of hooves bearing down on you. But momentum requires space to build, and psychological shock only works if the enemy panics and breaks. What if infantry simply refused to break? What if they held firm? What if instead of trying to dodge, instead of trying to countercharge, they just became an immovable wall? A formation so tightly packed, so disciplined, so utterly unbreakable that horses literally couldn't crash through it. It was radical going against every warrior's instinct. When cavalry charges at you, every cell in your body is screaming, "Run, take cover, get out of the way." Martel wanted the opposite. Stand your ground, lock your position, turn to ice. But theory doesn't win battles. Execution wins. And executing this theory required something most medieval armies didn't possess: absolute discipline. Martel spent weeks drilling his troops. Frankish infantry farmers and villagers hammered on a single command: hold the line, no matter what, no matter how many horses come, no matter the noise, no matter the fear. You hold, shields locked together, spears leveled, feet dug in, breathing steady. You become part of something bigger than yourself, a wall. And walls don't run, simple in theory. But when actual battle hits, when thousands of horsemen are stampeding towards you, when the earth itself is shaking under hooves, when war cries are ripping across the plains, maintaining the discipline becomes nearly impossible. Martel understood this. He also knew something else. Terrain is everything. Cavalry needs flat, open ground to be effective. Hills, forests, swamps, these all cripple their effectiveness. So Martel chose his ground meticulously. He positioned his army on slightly elevated terrain between Tours and Poitiers, backed by a tree line. In front, open field but not perfectly open, just tight enough, just uneven enough to funnel the attackers into a bottleneck. Limited angles for flanking maneuvers, forced them straight ahead into the teeth of his formation. It was a trap. Not a sprung one, a psychological trap. Al-Ghafiqi would see Frankish infantry dug in defensively. They'd look like sitting ducks. He'd attack with total confidence, and then he'd discover that these ducks had teeth. October 732. The two forces converge near Tours. Historians still argue over exact numbers, but everyone agrees. Al-Ghafiqi commanded tens of thousands of horsemen. Martel had maybe 15 to 30,000 foot soldiers. The numbers were close enough to debate, but by every tactical standard of the time, his position was hopeless. Infantry versus cavalry. This movie always ends the same way. The infantry gets trampled. Except this time, something different was about to happen. When Al-Ghafiqi saw the Frankish army on the ridge, he must have felt confident. He'd fought infantry before. He knew how to shatter them, charge, flank, overwhelm. But as his cavalry prepared to attack, something felt off. These Franks weren't moving. No nervous repositioning. No signs of fear. They stood completely still, shields locked tight, spears leveled, like statues, like ice. The battle's about to begin. The question that will determine Europe's future is about to be answered. Can trained infantry actually hold off elite cavalry? More important, for how long can they keep it up? Because just holding isn't victory. It's buying time. To actually win, Martel needs something more. A tactical gambit, a psychological weapon, something that transforms cavalry's greatest strength into its death. But what exactly was that something? How could an immovable wall not just defend, but win? The answer lay in Martel's understanding of the nature of mounted warfare, and it was about to unfold in one of the most decisive battles in human history. The Umayyads had conquered empires, but they had never faced anything like this. They had never encountered soldiers who refused to break, who refused to play by the accepted rules of medieval warfare, who transformed themselves through discipline and will into something more than men, into a wall of ice that wouldn't melt, no matter how fierce the fire thrown against it. And in the days that followed, near Tours, on fields now forgotten, that wall would be tested, repeatedly, brutally, without mercy. The answer would determine if Europe would become an extension of the Umayyad Caliphate, or if it would remain something different, something of its own. The answer lay in something no cavalry commander would expect. Something that violated every accepted principle of medieval warfare. Something that transformed common soldiers into a force that seemed almost supernatural in its capacity to resist. Charles Martel had grasped a fundamental truth about cavalry that eluded nearly all of his contemporaries. Cavalry wasn't invincible. It was psychological. Its power lay as much in the minds of the soldiers it faced as in the hooves trampling the ground. And if you could shatter that illusion of invincibility, if you could force mounted knights to question their own superiority, the shock and momentum that made cavalry lethal would simply evaporate. But how do you make a human wall not just hold, but win? The formation Martel had designed was ingeniously simple. Simple enough to be taught in weeks, not years. Simple enough for common men to execute amidst the absolute chaos of a cavalry charge. Yet complex enough to exploit every structural weakness inherent in mounted warfare. Infantry squares, tight, impenetrably tight. Men standing shoulder to shoulder, shields overlapping in layers to create not just protection, but a continuous, unbreakable surface. No gaps, no openings, no visible weak points where a cavalry lance could penetrate or a horse could force its way through. The front lines bore long, sharpened spears, angled outward and upward at 45 degrees. When the horses charged, they didn't meet individual men to be trampled. They met a forest of steel points. Points held firm by 3, 4, 5 ranks of men behind them, each adding his weight, his strength, his absolute refusal to yield a single inch. And here lay the true brilliance. Martel didn't just instruct his men to hold. He trained them to do absolutely nothing but hold. No counterattacks, no pursuits, no heroic attempts to advance or exploit an opening. Just hold, stand fast, transform into a fixed, immovable object that simply refused to acknowledge the cavalry as a threat. This was psychological warfare in its purest form. Cavalry relied on psychological momentum just as much as physical momentum. When knights charged and broke a line, panicked soldiers would flee, and that flight created more panic, more chaos, more disintegration. The cavalry won because its victims believed they were already defeated. The mere sight of mounted warriors thundering toward you was enough to make common men drop their weapons and run. But what if no one ran? What if the line simply held? What if, after charging repeatedly against a wall that wouldn't break, the knights began to question not the enemy's courage, but the validity of their own tactics? What would happen to the cavalry's morale then? The terrain Martel chose made all of this possible. He hadn't just camped anywhere. He had studied every inch of the battlefield near Tours. He selected slightly elevated ground, flanks protected by dense trees and rough terrain. There was no room for sweeping cavalry maneuvers, no room to flank. The Umayyads would have to attack head-on, straight into the teeth of the Frankish formation, repeatedly, unable to use their superior mobility to find a weak point. Cavalry without mobility wasn't cavalry. It was just men on horses trying to push against an immovable wall. And when the first days of the clash began, That is exactly what happened. The Umayyads arrived with the swagger of conquerors who had swept aside armies across 3 continents. Abd al-Rahman al-Ghafiqi, eyeing the Frankish formations for the first time, must have felt a mix of curiosity and disdain. Foot soldiers, stationary, waiting to be slaughtered. Nothing the Umayyad cavalry hadn't faced and crushed a dozen times before. But when the first charges were launched, the impossible happened. The line didn't break. Horses galloped toward the Frankish squares, gaining speed, momentum, the thunder of hooves promising annihilation. And then they crashed against overlapping shields and spear points that didn't budge, not an inch. The horses, intelligent animals that they were, instinctively pulled back before full impact. No horse willingly gallops into a wall of steel spikes. They slowed. They veered off. They created confusion. And amidst that confusion, the Frankish formation simply stood fast, holding, watching, waiting for the next wave. Day after day, the pattern repeated. Umayyad cavalry charges wave after wave of mounted warriors trying to break what began to seem less like men and more like a force of nature. A wall of ice, cold, impassive, relentless, absorbing attacks while offering nothing in return but unyielding resistance. Umayyad frustration mounted. How do you defeat something that simply refuses to be defeated? How do you break an enemy that isn't trying to win but simply refuses to lose? Each failed charge was a psychological blow. Each return to those unmoving squares was a tacit admission that the cavalry, that invincible force that had toppled empires, had finally met something it couldn't understand and couldn't overcome. Martel watched from within the formation, walking among his troops, reinforcing the only order that mattered. Hold. Don't advance. Don't pursue. Do nothing but stay exactly where you are, because victory wouldn't come from killing knights. It would come from breaking their will to keep trying. On the 3rd day, the Umayyad charges began to decrease in frequency. Not because Abd al-Rahman had given up, but because even elite warriors need rest. Horses need rest. And when you charge repeatedly against a barrier that won't yield, physical exhaustion combines with psychological doubt to create something dangerous. Hesitation. The silent death of military discipline. For the Franks, however, holding was easier than charging. They didn't waste energy on futile assaults. They simply stood their ground. And with every passing hour, every day the wall of ice didn't melt, their confidence grew. Maybe it was possible. Maybe foot soldiers could defeat cavalry. Maybe the hammer knew something every other European commander had missed. This belief rippled through the Frankish formation like wildfire. You could see it on their faces. They'd done the impossible. They'd held against what everyone said was unstoppable. If they could hold for 3 days, they could hold for a week, 2 weeks, as long as it took. Day 6 broke with a different kind of tension. Abd al-Rahman was running out of time. Invading armies can't camp indefinitely. Supplies run dry, morale cracks. And the longer these Frankish soldiers held the line, the harder it became to ignore what no Umayyad commander wanted to admit. Cavalry wasn't going to break them, not this way. But backing off was impossible, politically unthinkable. Abd al-Rahman had launched this invasion promising to push the caliphate into Western Europe's heart. Retreating to Iberia beaten by foot soldiers would humiliate him, wreck his legacy, and destabilize Umayyad control over everything they'd already conquered. He needed victory, or at least something he could spin as victory. So he did what desperate commanders always do. Go all in. Massive final assault. Everything or nothing. He'd marshal every mounted warrior he had left and hit them with a coordinated charge that couldn't be stopped, because even a wall of ice has to break eventually. There's always a breaking point where ordinary men crack, where panic overwrites discipline, where the formation collapses into chaos. Abd al-Rahman was betting everything on finding that point. The hammer was betting everything that this point did not exist. And on the morning of the 7th day, as the Umayyad forces lined up for what would be the fiercest assault yet, both sides knew. This would decide everything. There would be no turning back. There would be no other chance. What happened in the next few hours would determine whether Europe remained divided among Christian kingdoms, or if the Umayyad Caliphate would add another continent to its growing dominion. The hammer walked through the formation one last time, He looked into the eyes of men who'd held the line for 6 days against the impossible. Same order, same words he'd given from day one. Hold, no matter what, no matter how many charge, hold. Because victory wouldn't come from bravery or strength or combat skills. It would come from sheer refusal. Absolute, unrelenting refusal to break. Refusing to accept cavalry as superior. Refusing to play by everyone else's rules. And when the final charge began, when thousands of Umayyad horsemen galloped toward the Frankish squares with the fury of men who know there is no tomorrow, the wall of ice did what it had done for 6 days. It stood firm, absorbed the impact, refused to melt. But there was a difference now. This charge was different, more desperate, more chaotic. And in the chaos, something would happen that no one could have predicted. Something that would decide not just this battle, but the trajectory of centuries. The climax would come at a moment no one expected. A single decision. A single action. That would transform a defensive stand into a decisive victory, and change the fate of a continent forever. It was the 7th day. Exhaustion weighed on both armies like a shroud. The Franks, positioned in their tight formations, felt every muscle protest. Their shields were cracked, their spears stained with dried blood. But their eyes remained fixed, their lines unshakable. Across the field, the Umayyad cavalry prepared what they knew to be the last attack. There was no more time, no more provisions, no more choices. Abd al-Rahman al-Ghafiqi, the commander who had conquered cities and broken kingdoms, stared at the wall of Frankish shields and understood the terrible truth. 6 days of furious assaults, 6 days of blood and iron, and that line of infantry, those unmoving foot soldiers, still remained. He gathered his commanders. The orders were clear. All forces, all reserves, everything that remained of the war machine that had swept through Iberia. It would be thrown against that line. And if the wall of ice broke, Europe would be open. If it didn't break, the invasion would end there. On that field, on that day. Charles Martel walked among his ranks for the last time. He made no speeches. He promised no glory. He simply looked into his men's eyes and saw there what he needed to see. Determination, confidence in the plan, faith in the formation. He nodded. They understood. One more time. Just one more time. The sun was sinking when the Umayyad cavalry began their final push. Not an orderly charge this time. It was an avalanche of iron and desperation. Thousands of horsemen on their swift war horses, screaming prayers and promises of vengeance, crashing down on the Franks like a storm. The impact was deafening. Shields crashing into horses, spears puncturing armor, the sound of men against men echoing across the valley. And the wall of ice shook. For the first time in 7 days, it actually shook. But it held. The Frankish formation absorbed the impact. They gave ground a few feet. Shields splintered. Men dropped. But the line sealed the gap. Rear ranks stepped forward to fill the spaces. Frankish spears found targets. Horses couldn't break through, spinning in panicked circles. The battlefield became chaos. And in that chaos, Abd al-Rahman made the choice that changed everything. Watching his forces crumble, seeing the impossible happen again, he did what most commanders wouldn't. He rode forward. Not to watch from safety, not to yell orders, but to inspire. To prove his men that even their leader would break through that damn infantry line. It was an act of courage. It was an act of desperation. It was a fatal mistake. Because in the whirlwind of battle, where cavalry and infantry intertwined in mortal combat, Abd al-Rahman al-Ghafiqi became not a distant commander, but a target. The Frankish soldiers saw him. The commander. The man who terrorized Europe. And they reacted like wolves spotting wounded prey. A group of Frankish warriors broke formation. Not to chase, but to focus on one target. To reach that man in the middle of the chaos. What happened next took seconds. But those seconds would echo for centuries. Surrounded, Abd al-Rahman fought like a lion. His sword flashed, men fell. But there were too many. He was isolated, far from his lines, far from support, far from help. A Frankish spear found its target. Then another. And in that deafening chaos, a battle deciding a continent's fate, Abd al-Rahman al-Ghafiqi, conqueror of Iberia, The general who dreamed of Paris and Rome fell. No announcement. No proclamation. Just the moment a man fell from his horse and didn't get back up. But in medieval warfare, a commander's death wasn't just losing a leader. It was losing the entire chain of command. It was the psychological implosion of an entire army. The Umayyad soldiers, fighting with the savagery of men, convinced they'd already won, felt the shift before they understood it. Orders went silent. Coordination evaporated. Then, like a whisper becoming a scream, the words spread through the army. The commander is down. Abd al-Rahman is dead. The effect was immediate. This wasn't a tactical retreat. It was a collapse. The Umayyad cavalry pressing the Frankish lines seconds before with everything they had started pulling back. First in small groups, then in waves, then a full rout. Martel, watching from his position, could hardly believe what he was seeing. The line had held. But now, the enemy was running. The invasion that had swept through Iberia and threatened to engulf Europe was collapsing right before him. He didn't order pursuit. His men were spent, and he was too smart a strategist to risk a hard-won victory on a desperate chase. He let them retreat, let them carry their wounded, let them vanish into the distance, because he knew they would not return. When the sun came up on day 8, the battlefield near Tours was quiet. Bodies scattered across the ground, broken weapons everywhere. But standing in the middle of it all, the Frankish formation, exhausted, bleeding, victorious. Martel walked across the field. His men-foot soldiers who'd just beaten the best cavalry in the world watched him with something deeper than respect. It was awe. It was gratitude. It was the wordless knowledge that they'd been part of something historic. The Umayyad invasion was finished. Not by the fall of a city, not by a peace treaty, but by the death of one man and an army learning that mobility without command is just chaos. The Umayyads retreated to Iberia. No more attempts to push north. No more threats to Paris. No siege on Rome. Tours 732 marked the end of Islamic expansion in Western Europe. Right there, on that field, history made its turn. Because this wasn't just about who controlled France. It was about the entire trajectory of Western civilization. Imagine for a moment what would have happened if Abd al-Rahman had remained alive. If the Umayyad cavalry had broken the Frankish line in that final charge, Paris would have fallen, the Frankish kingdoms would have disintegrated. Western Europe, fragmented and disorganized, would have been absorbed by the Umayyad Caliphate just as Iberia had been. European culture, as we know it, would have taken a radically different path. There would be no Renaissance centered in Florence. There would be no Reformation starting in Wittenberg. The language, the religion, the political structure of an entire continent would have been transformed. But that didn't happen. Because foot soldiers, positioned in tight formations, refused to break. And because a brilliant commander understood that sometimes the best strategy is not to attack, but simply not to retreat. Martel didn't realize, standing on that field in 732, that he was rewriting world history. He just knew he'd defended his land, protected his people, and proved a radical idea could actually work. But history remembered. It gave him a name that would echo through the centuries. Charles Martel, the Hammer, the man who stopped an empire's expansion with pure force of will. And his grandson, Charlemagne, would go on to unify Western Europe into an empire that would shape the continent for 1,000 years. And the soldiers who held that line? They went back to their villages, told their stories, and passed down a lesson that military commanders studied for centuries. Trained infantry, well-positioned, with good terrain and smart leadership, can beat superior cavalry. All the mobility in the world means nothing if the line won't break. Shock tactics fail if the formation absorbs it. Speed doesn't win if the enemy simply won't move. Tours 732 proved war isn't won by who has the best gear or fastest soldiers. It's about tactics, it's about psychology, it's about using what you have more effectively than your enemy. The wall didn't win because it was stronger. It won because it was smarter. Because Martel grasped something fundamental about medieval warfare. Cavalry's power came from 3 things: mobility, shock, fear. And he built a strategy that killed all 3. Mobility, useless when the enemy won't chase. Shock, absorbed by locked shields and spear walls. Fear, eliminated by ironclad discipline and faith in the plan. And when Abd al-Rahman fell, When one man's death turned a 7-day battle into a minutes-long collapse, another lesson came through crystal clear. In medieval warfare, leadership wasn't a bonus, it was everything. Lose the commander, you lose. Period. No matter how strong your army is. The field of Tours became more than just a battlefield. It became a symbol, a reminder that entire civilizations get saved by ordinary people who refuse to break. That the impossible becomes possible when you understand the game better than your enemy. Today, 13 centuries later, you can still visit that field. It's quiet now. Peaceful. No monument marks where Europe was saved. No plaque shows where Abd al-Rahman fell or where the wall held. But history remembers, and it teaches us something clear. The biggest victories don't come from the biggest armies. Tactical genius beats raw numbers. Discipline is as powerful as any weapon. And sometimes, winning means simply refusing to lose. Martel and his foot soldiers didn't change history because they were legendary warriors. They changed history because they grasped something fundamental. In a contest between mobility and formation, speed and discipline, offense and resilience, the side that understands the battlefield wins. And on that field near Tours in 732, the Frankish infantry got it exactly right. They became a wall of ice, cold, relentless, unmovable. When the storm finally broke, when the cavalry retreated and the invasion ended, that wall was still standing, proving that sometimes the way forward is simply refusing to retreat. If this story about tactical genius changing history grabbed you, hit like so more people see how seemingly impossible battles get won through smart strategy. Subscribe to explore more decisive battles, the moments when the underdog beat the odds. Drop a comment. Which military tactic throughout history has impressed you most? The Macedonian phalanx? English longbowmen at Agincourt? Modern blitzkrieg? We want to hear. Because military history isn't about who won, it's about how they won. And sometimes that how rewrites everything. Next time we're diving into another battle where the underdog army, smaller, outgunned, used terrain and brilliant tactics to crush an supposedly unstoppable invader. Another underdog. Another lesson on how smart beats strong. Until then, remember, 1300 years ago, foot soldiers proved discipline beats speed, that tactics beat technology, and that one battle can determine a continent's future. Tours, 732. Where a wall of ice stopped an empire.